If you made it into a film, it would be an 18 rating for gore and violence. So what I thought we'd do is try and look at some of the big themes of the passage rather than dealing with the things section by section. So we're going to read the whole block through, which is quite a long section. So just so that you kids don't have to listen to me reading a chapter and a half, if you want to head out early, that's fine. So if you want to go a bit before, that's no problem. And the rest of us will read through 2 Kings chapter 9, and starting at verse 14 and through to the end of chapter 10, and then we'll sing again, and then we'll have a look at the passage. So 2 Kings chapter 9, verse 14, and we're going to read all the way through to the end of chapter 10. This is our entire section for today. It's all one big story. 2 Kings 9, verse 14. Thus Jehu, the son of Jehoshaphat, the son of Nimshi, conspired against Joram. Now Joram with all Israel had been on guard at Ramoth-Gilead against Hazael, king of Syria. But King Joram had returned to be healed in Jezreel of the wounds the Syrians had given him when he fought with Hazael, king of Syria. So Jehu said, "If this is your decision, then let no one slip out of the city and go and tell the news in Jezreel." Then Jehu mounted his chariot and went down to Jezreel, for Joram lay there, and Ahaziah, king of Judah, had come down to visit Joram. Now the watchman who was standing on the tower in Jezreel, and he saw the company of Jehu as he came and said, "I see a company." Joram said, "Take a horseman and send to meet him, and let him say, 'Is it peace?'" So a man on horseback went to meet him and said, "Thus says the king, 'Is it peace?'" And Jehu said, "What do you have to do with peace? Turn round and ride behind me." And the watchman reported, saying, "The messenger reached them, but he's not coming back." Then he sent out a second horseman who came to them and said, "Thus the king has said, 'Is it peace?'" And Jehu answered, "What do you have to do with peace? Turn round and ride behind me." Again the watchman reported, "He reached them, but he's not coming back. And the driving is like the driving of Jehu, son of Nimshi, for he drives furiously." Joram said, "Make ready." And they made ready his chariot. Then Joram, king of Israel, and Ahaziah, king of Judah, set out, each in his chariot, and went to meet Jehu, and met him at the property of Naboth the Jezreelite. And when Joram saw Jehu, he said, "Is it peace, Jehu?" He answered, "What peace can there be, so long as the whorings and sorceries of your mother Jezebel are so many?" Then Joram reined about and fled, saying to Ahaziah, "Treachery, O Ahaziah!" And Jehu drew his bow with his full strength and shot Joram between the shoulders, so the arrow pierced his heart and he sank in his chariot. Jehu said to Bidkar, his aide, "Take it up and throw him on the plot of ground belonging to Naboth the Jezreelite. For remember when you and I rode side by side behind Ahab his father, and the Lord made this pronouncement against him. As surely as I saw yesterday the blood of Naboth and the blood of his sons, declares the Lord, I will repay you on this plot of ground. Now therefore take it up and throw him on the plot of ground in accordance with the word of the Lord." When Ahaziah, the king of Judah, saw this, he fled in the direction of Beth-Haggar. And Jehu pursued him and said, "Shoot him also." And they shot him in the chariot at the ascent of Gur, which is by Ibleam. And he fled to Megiddo and died there. His servants carried him in a chariot to Jerusalem and buried him in the tomb with his fathers in the city of David. In the 11th year of Joram the son of Ahab, Ahaziah began to reign over Judah. When Jehu came to Jezreel, Jezebel heard of it, and she painted her eyes and adorned her head and looked out of the window. And as Jehu entered the gate, she said, "Is it peace, you Zimri, murderer of your master?" And he lifted up his face to the window and said, "Who's on my side? Who?" 2 or 3 eunuchs looked down at him. He said, "Throw her down." So they threw her down, and some of her blood spattered on the wall and on the horses, and they trampled her. Then he went in and ate and drank, and he said, "See now to this cursed woman and bury her, for she is a king's daughter." But when they went to bury her, they found no more of her than the skull and the feet and the palms of her hands. When they came back and told him, he said, "This is the word of the Lord, which he spoke by his servant Elijah the Tishbite. In the territory of Jezreel, the dog shall eat the flesh of Jezebel, and the corpse of Jezebel shall be as dung on the face of the field in the territory of Jezreel, so that no one can say, 'This is Jezebel.'" Now Ahab had 70 sons in Samaria. So Jehu wrote letters and sent them to Samaria, to the rulers of the city, to the elders and to the guardians of the sons of Ahab, saying, "Now then, as soon as this letter comes to you, seeing your master's sons are with you, and there are with you chariots and horses, fortified cities also, and weapons, select the best and fittest of your master's sons, and set him on his father's throne, and fight for your master's house." But they were exceedingly afraid, and said, "Behold, the 2 kings couldn't stand before him. How then can we stand?" So he who was over the palace, and he who was over the city, together with the elders and the guardians, sent to Jehu, saying, "We are your servants, and we will do all that you tell us. We will not make anyone king. Do whatever is good in your eyes." Then he wrote to them a second letter, saying, "If you're on my side, and if you're ready to obey me, take the heads of your master's sons and come to me at Jezreel tomorrow at this time." Now the king's sons, 70 persons, with the great men of the city, who were bringing them up. As soon as the letter came to them, they took the king's sons and slaughtered them, 70 persons, and put their heads in baskets and sent them to him at Jezreel. When the messenger came and told him they brought the heads of the king's sons, he said, "Lay them in 2 heaps at the entrance of the gate until morning." But in the morning, when he went out, he stood and said to all the people, "You are innocent. It was I who conspired against my master and killed him. But who struck down all these? Know then there shall fall to the earth nothing of the word of the Lord, which the Lord spoke concerning the house of Ahab, for the Lord has done what he said by his servant Elijah." So Jehu struck down all who remained of the house of Ahab in Jezreel, all his great men and his close friends and his priests, and he left him none remaining. Then he set out and went to Samaria. On the way, when he was at Beth-Eked with the shepherds, Jehu met the relatives of Ahaziah, king of Judah, and he said, "Who are you?" And they answered, "We are the relatives of Ahaziah, and we came down to visit the royal princes and the sons of the queen mother." He said, "Take them alive." And they took them alive and slaughtered them at the pit of Beth-Eked, 42 persons, and he spared none of them. When he departed from there, he met Jehonadab, the son of Rechab, coming to meet him. And he greeted him and said to him, "Is your heart true to my heart as mine is to yours?" And Jehonadab answered, "It is." Jehu said, "If it is, give me your hand." So he gave him his hand, and Jehu took him up with him into the chariot, and he said, "Come with me, and see my zeal for the Lord." So he had him ride in his chariot, and when he came to Samaria, he struck down all who remained to Ahab in Samaria, till he wiped them out, according to the word of the Lord that he spoke to Elijah. Then Jehu assembled all the people and said to them, "Ahab served Baal a little, but Jehu will serve him much. Now therefore, call to me all the prophets of Baal, all his worshippers and all his priests, let none be missing, for I have a great sacrifice to offer to Baal. Whoever is missing shall not live." But Jehu did it with cunning in order to destroy the worshippers of Baal. And Jehu ordered, "Sanctify a solemn assembly for Baal." So they proclaimed it. And Jehu sent throughout all Israel, and all the worshippers of Baal came, so that there was not a man left who did not come. And they entered the house of Baal, and the house of Baal was filled from one end to the other. He said to him who was in charge of the wardrobe, "Bring out the vestments for all the worshippers of Baal." So he brought out all the vestments for him. And then Jehu went into the house of Baal with Jehonadab, the son of Rechab, and said to the worshippers of Baal, "Search and see that there is no servant of the Lord here among you, but only the worshippers of Baal." Then they went in to offer sacrifices and burnt offerings. Now Jehu had stationed 80 men outside and said, "The man who allows any of those whom I have given into your hands to escape shall forfeit his life." So as soon as he made an end of the offering, the burnt offering, Jehu said to the guard and to the officers, "Go in and strike them down, let not a man escape." So when they put them to the sword, the guard and the officers cast them out and went into the inner room of the house of Baal. And they brought down the pillar that was in the house of Baal and burnt it. They demolished the pillar of Baal and demolished the house of Baal and made it a latrine to this day. Thus Jehu wiped out Baal from Israel. But Jehu did not turn aside from the sins of Jeroboam the son of Nebat, which he made Israel to commit. That is, the golden calves that were in Bethel and in Dan. And the Lord said to Jehu, "Because you have done well in carrying out what is right in my eyes, and have done to the house of Ahab according to all that was in my heart, your sons of the 4th generation shall sit on the throne of Israel." But Jehu was not careful to walk in the law of the Lord, the God of Israel, with all his heart. He did not turn from the sins of Jeroboam, which he made Israel to sin. In those days the Lord began to cut off parts of Israel. Hazael defeated them throughout the territory of Israel. From the Jordan eastwards, all the land of Gilead, the Gadites, the Reubenites, the Manassites, from Aroer, which is by the valley of Arnon, that is Gilead and Bashan. And the rest of the acts of Jehu, and all that he did, and all his might, are not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Israel. So Jehu slept with his fathers, and they buried him in Samaria, and Jehoahaz his son reigned in his place. The time that Jehu reigned over Israel in Samaria was 28 years. Thank you. So there's our passage. Sorry if I've read that too quickly. My reading is sometimes like Jehu's driving. Now it seems pretty detailed and pretty graphic. Like I said, it's a bit of a bloodbath from start to finish. And although it is quite has a lot of detail in there, like a lot of these narratives, it has been quite carefully constructed. So I want to just run through it again, but through three repeated ideas that you get in this passage. Now, the first of these is peace. Now, there's a question which recurs three times in chapter 9, verses 17 and 18, verse 22 and verse 31. It's that question, is it peace? Is it peace? And the answer is clearly and quite obviously no, it's not peace. There is no peace, and there never can be peace while Ahab's house is still reigning. And I think what the narrator is trying to do by this repeated question is help us to see, or at least to set Jehu's actions in the context of the wider story that is taking place. That what Jehu is going to do is part of the process by which order will be restored in some measure to the country. And any chance for peace, any chance that there might be for the answer to be yes, it is peace, is only going to come about through all these things that take place. So you have that repeated question in chapter 9. Is it peace? And the answer is not. But what Jehu is doing is is being used in a way that might at least bring about the chance for peace. Now, that process is quite a violent one. And in chapter 10, you get again three summary statements given that describe what Jehu does. So in amongst all the narrative that tells you what happened, there are three moments when the narrator of the passage kind of stops and pauses to give us a little bit of a summary of what is taking place. So verse 11, Jehu struck down all who remained of the house of Ahab in Jezreel. Verse 17, he struck down all who remained from Ahab in Samaria. And verse 28, Jehu wiped out Baal from Israel. You get these kind of three short statements that, if you want the PG version and to skip over all the bloodshed, you can kind of capture it from the three summaries the narrator gives us. So, is there peace? No, there is no peace, and there can't be peace while Ahab's royal house is still around. So, how do you solve that? Well, the solution here is violence, and Jehu is basically going to kill off a lot of people through the course of these two chapters. Now, that is challenging enough in its own right, but there's another kind of repeated idea that occurs through both chapters 9 and 10, and that is this idea that these things that are happening are fulfilling the word of the Lord. So twice in chapter 9, in verse 26 and 36, that idea that this is in accordance with the word of the Lord, this is the word of the Lord, and then again twice in chapter 10, 10 verse 10, 10 verse 17. There shall fall to the earth nothing of the word of the Lord, which the Lord spoke concerning the house of Ahab. And then again, according to the word of the Lord that he spoke to Elijah. So you have an absence of peace, basically because Ahab's house is still there. The solution is violence on a national scale. And if that wasn't hard enough in a sense to deal with, you know that this is happening because it's fulfilling something God has said. This isn't just indiscriminate violence by Jehu. This is, in some way, judgment on Ahab's house. And that is explained, in a sense, by the fact that God is bringing a deserved judgment on them. That there's a sense in which Jehu's actions are fulfilling prophecy and God's will. Now, what is the prophecy being fulfilled? That's not entirely easy to know. It might not even be a prophecy at one point recorded in 1 and 2 Kings. It's not easy to tie up what is here in these two chapters with some of what's gone on before. But the narrator doesn't seem to worry too much about that. Rather than the details of the prophecy and where it's come from in that broader sense, he just wants us to know this has come from God. This is God's will that this is happening. This is to fulfill what God has said. And there's a kind of irony that runs through these chapters, which again the narrator seems to want us to understand. It's a whole ironic process that is taking place here. Joram's body is dumped onto land that belonged to Naboth, exactly the same Naboth who Jezebel conspired to kill earlier on so that Ahab could have his vineyard. There's almost that sort of, you know it's coming because the narrator makes that statement for us. So that they catch up with Joram, and where do they do it? Oh, it just happens to be at land that belonged to Naboth. So you have that kind of irony that there's the descendant of Ahab dumped on land that Ahab conspired to acquire through murder. And then you also get more information that you didn't have back in 1 Kings. Chapter 9, verse 26 suggests that Jezebel had not only conspired to kill Naboth, but had also conspired to have Naboth's sons killed as well. It wasn't just the blood of Naboth, it was the blood of Naboth's sons. Now, that's not recorded in 1 Kings 21, but it is logical enough. I mean, if Ahab is seeking to acquire something that is part of the family of Naboth, killing off his sons then frees up the inheritance for Ahab to move in and take it. But it also increases the sense of irony. Back in this previous time, Ahab has conspired to kill the sons of Naboth, and now whose sons are killed off in this passage? It's Ahab's sons that are killed as well. So you've kind of got 3 ideas dotted through these 2 chapters. There's no peace in the land, and there can't be with Ahab's house around. Judgment is coming on Ahab's house, and it will be bloody. It will be fatal for many people. But that judgment is also God's will. Now, that sort of summary of a couple of chapters then leaves us with a couple of questions, which we'll explore a little bit now and then in the discussion afterwards. Firstly, when we're thinking about Jehu, it's all well and good saying that God hates injustice, which is fine, and judgment must come, which again is okay, we can run with that. But when you see Jehu, you kind of start to wonder, who is this person that God is choosing to use to bring about judgment in this case? I mean, doesn't Jehu seem a little bit too committed through these couple of chapters? I mean, he is certainly the instrument of God's judgment on the house of Ahab. King Joram, all the sons of Ahab are killed. And there's something for doing that. There's a kind of a reward for Jehu in 2 senses. Firstly, that summary statement at the end of chapter 10, 10 verse 30, when it said that Jehu did what was right. Now, Jehu is the only king of the northern kingdom of Israel ever to receive a commendation for doing what is right. No other king in the northern kingdom of Israel is ever commended for doing what's right. There's just one bad king after another. So there's that. So Jehu gets this commendation. So there's certainly some positive things to what he's doing. And he also gets a reward. 4 generations of his royal house will sit on the throne of Israel. So there are some positive things to that, and you can see the way that God is choosing to use him. God speaks well of him, and he's been blessed for that. And his actions go beyond just the kingdom of Israel. In Judah, the king there, Ahaziah, is killed. We should remember the 2 royal houses at this point are united by marriage. That was in the week, 2 Kings 8, described how these 2 houses are now linked together. So getting rid of Ahab's royal house in Israel is going to have implications for Judah as well. And Jehu manages to kill both. So it does make sense that if he wants to get rid of anyone connected with Ahab's house, that's going to spill over the border from Israel in the north down to Judah in the south. The other thing Jehu does is get rid of all the prophets of Baal. Now, Jehu is never actually told to go after the prophets of Baal, but he does that anyway. On one hand, you could say that's a good thing. Certainly when you look at the Old Testament law, Deuteronomy, I mean, what he's doing to the prophets of Baal is what Deuteronomy 13, I think, requires to be done. So on the face of it, it does seem a good thing. You could maybe accuse Jehu of mixed motives in there. Again, if you think back to Ahab and Jezebel, I mean, Jezebel was supporting the worship of Baal. It was a state-sponsored religion in that sense. So it's almost certain that there will be a high number of supporters of the house of Ahab and of Jezebel among that group of people. So if you've killed off Ahab's son, or descendant, the king Joram, if you've killed off Ahab's sons, you've killed Jezebel, you've killed the kind of royal family in Judah, who else is there left who might be a supporter of Ahab and Jezebel? Well, probably among the priests of the prophets of Baal. So on the one hand, is a good thing to do. You're clearing the country of false worship. But it's also quite convenient that killing all these people consolidates Jehu's position quite significantly and leaves him a lot more powerful after having done that. Which then starts to make you wonder, was all this really zeal for the Lord, as he says, or is there an element of kind of political expediency in amongst what he's doing? And then as you get to the end, you really start to see Jehu's flaws. And that summary passage in chapter 10, verses 28 to 33, you're going to have two pairs. You have two commendations, two things that Jehu is said to have done well, set out with kind of two caveats, two qualifications. Jehu did well, he did this, but Jehu also did this. So Jehu wipes out the Baal worship in the country, but Jehu doesn't turn from Jeroboam's sin with golden calves. Jehu destroys the house of Ahab, but Jehu doesn't walk in the law of the Lord, which is maybe why his reward is limited. He's promised sons which will sit on the throne to the fourth generation, which is good, but nothing like we saw with David in previous studies. Maybe limited obedience results in limited blessing, you could say that. And it also starts to make you wonder then about that whole destroying all the prophets of Baal thing. If Jehu had destroyed the prophets of Baal out of passion for God, why did he then not abandon worship of the golden calves? If his passion for God, if his zeal for the Lord is what drives him to wipe out all these prophets, wouldn't it then be logical to actually return to worship of the Lord rather than seeking after pursuing the false religion that Jeroboam had established? So there's a sense in which, although things are better in Israel after Jehu, it doesn't really restore Israel either. He kind of resets it back to where it was before Ahab, which wasn't in a great place to start with. Things are improved after Jehu, but they're not where they should be either. And then because of that disobedience, God starts to gradually chip away at Jehu's kingdom. So the one who has done all this violence by the sword is then said God starts to cut off parts of his kingdom. In the same way that Jehu was conspired to cut off people's heads, now Jehu will have his kingdom cut into bits as well. And ironically, Hazael is now raised up as an instrument of God's judgment to punish Jehu, who was raised up as an instrument of God's judgment, which is a kind of a cycle you can see in the Old Testament as a whole, in a bigger sense, with the kingdoms of Assyria and Babylonia and things like that. And then just to kind of compound it, to move almost beyond the passage that we have here, this location, Jezreel, crops up again some years later, but not in the book of 2 Kings. During the reign of Jeroboam II, who is the great-grandson of Jehu, the prophet Hosea starts his ministry. And as Hosea starts his ministry, one of the things he is called to do is to name his first son Jezreel. It's Hosea 1, verses 4 and 5. Is to call his son Jezreel. And what is the whole idea of naming his son Jezreel? I don't think the idea is that there's going to be a punishment coming on the house of Jehu for all the bloodshed at Jezreel. I think there's enough in this passage we have here today to suggest that this is done because it's the Lord's will. I think the point that Hosea is being instructed to make through the naming of his son, Jezreel, with all the reminder of the bloodshed and that happened there, is simply this. Jehu didn't actually turn out to be any better than any of the previous royal houses. All the blood of chapters 9 and 10 of 2 Kings didn't really change anything. By the time you get to his great-grandson, Jeroboam II, the people are still off worshipping foreign gods. The country still hasn't returned to the Lord. And the same pride and arrogance that brought about the fall of the house of Ahab will now bring about the fall of the house of Jehu. And not long after Hosea prophesies, Jeroboam's son Zechariah is assassinated and bloodshed ends the house of Jehu. And I think what Hosea is trying to say to us is simply that. all that Jehu did in this chapter, all the bloodshed that was there, all the people that died at Jezreel, all these things that took place, yes, it was God's will at this point, and yes, God used it to judge Ahab's house. But did it really change anything? Actually, no, it didn't in that sense. And so the house of Jehu, after 4 generations, will meet a bloody end as well. So, what is that saying to us now? I wonder if it could simply be this. Throughout history, there have always been people like Jehu. There are people who God has used to bring about his will, and sometimes who God has used to bring judgment on others in different situations. But they're people who haven't truly followed God himself. And sometimes in history, there are people who have used faith and religion both to gain and to consolidate power. I suspect that's what is happening with Jehu. There's some mixed motives going on here. Maybe there is a zeal for the Lord there, but I think there's also a kind of, there's a zeal for the Lord which also happens to be quite good for Jehu. Setting himself up as a king, gaining power, consolidating power, and having 4 generations of kings follow him. And people have always used faith and religion and mixed that up with personal ambition. But the challenge is, I think, when people come into power in that situation, and people appear to do things that seem to reflect a better situation for the church than we have been in before, then Christians can get quite excited by that, and rightly so. But when you look through history, often things end up somewhat similar to how you have in this chapter, in this narrative through from 1 and 2 Kings through into Hosea. Now, I came across this quote from this was a political leader in the 20th century. There was a change in rule in one country. The ruling power was overthrown and a new group came in. And this is what the leader of the new group who came in said, describing what he wanted for the country that was to come. Each person must have complete freedom not only to observe any faith, but also to propagate any faith. None of the officials should even have a right to ask anyone of his faith. This is a matter of conscience, and nobody should dare to interfere in this field. Well, that sounds great, and you can, I mean, if someone was kind of campaigning in the UK with that as part of their standpoint, we'd be all up for that. And you can see why Christians were rejoicing in that country when the previous rulers were overthrown and when this guy came in. If I tell you who the person was that said it, Vladimir Lenin, things don't look quite so good. When you track that through history, what he might have said at the start, the way the church in Russia was happy when the Bolsheviks were overthrown, when the Tsar was deposed, when it appeared that religious freedom was coming, doesn't look quite so good from the perspective of history. You look back 100 years later. And the problem is the same as you have in the case of Jehu. Jehus tend to promise more than they can deliver, whether that is explicitly or implicitly. And even attempts that are good to try and resolve injustice can easily become wrapped up in mixed motives or in haste or personal ambition. And so I guess the lesson from Jehu, in a sense, is while we should always respect and pray for governments and for leaders, we thought about that a couple of Sundays ago in 1 Timothy 2, we must learn never to place our faith in them. Jehu is used by God, but is flawed and then punished by God. And no matter how good any political leader or any other kind of leader appears to be, and no matter how much God appears to be using that person to bring about changes that we as Christians would like to see, in the end, we have to learn how to see past that person and to see that they are ultimately instruments of God. And we mustn't be deceived into placing our hope in them or overlooking their flaws in pursuit of what we think God can offer through them. God raises up and God brings down. And ultimately, God is the only one in whom we should be trusting. We pray for our government. We pray for governments worldwide. And we're happy when they pass laws and bring things into place that make life easier for us as Christians to share our faith. There's nothing wrong with that. But ultimately, our faith is not placed in the governments that we have, but is placed in the God who is over all these governments. And even when things don't seem to work out as we hope, we trust that God is still in control. I guess the challenge of a Jehu is not to be deceived into placing our trust in the Jehus of this world, the people that God uses, but ultimately to make sure that our trust and confidence and hope is placed in God himself. Now, there's kind of another issue that's there, which is simply this. I mean, how can God allow Jehu to go around killing everyone? Doesn't all that seem really quite violent? Is it not possible for God to have arranged for a plague to have swept through the country, which just happened to kill off all the family of Ahab and left most of the population unscathed? I mean, God could do that, but in this case, he chooses to work through Jehu. So how do we resolve that? I guess in a sense, firstly, you can say that whenever you read these narratives and you look through history after that, God chooses to work through flawed humans. God has always done that and always still continues to do that. There's a sense in which, although none of us here are guilty of kind of mass murder on the scale of Jehu, none of us are perfect. All of us are flawed humans. Maybe not doing things that Jehu did, but there's a sense in which you could ask the same thing of us. Why does God choose to work through us? Why does God not just do things himself? So we still are beneficiaries of that same principle, that God chooses to work through flawed humans. And in spite of our defects and deficiencies and weaknesses, God chooses to work through us. And I guess the second thing you can say is that sooner or later, judgment is always unpleasant. Jehu is acting here as God's instrument of justice. There's been huge injustice in the country. There can be no peace while Ahab's family lives and rules. And Jehu is being used as an instrument of justice by God to bring judgment. And judgment will always, in the end, be unpleasant. However you phrase that and however that works itself out. There's a sense in which that gets worse in the New Testament, not better. I mean, when you hit the New Testament, you discover the true reality of hell. You're not just talking about somebody being killed in this life. You now understand that judgment means eternal punishment. And that the scale of God's judgment and justice is almost greater in the New Testament than in the Old. Judgment in some ways will always be a challenging and difficult thing and always be unpleasant. I guess you can say that there's a sense in which judgment is rooted in love. That judgment isn't something that God desires as the one who loves. There's a sense in which judgment is invited by the loveless. When you play with God's love, when you treat God's love lightly, and this is what Hosea is teaching again through his relationship with Gomer, that makes a mockery of God's standards and life's meaning and life's values. When you persist in abusing the love that God wants to share, that in the end produces a kind of self-induced judgment. So although judgment is unpleasant, God fulfills his word. God does punish injustice, but sometimes God chooses to use ways which are difficult for us with a kind of modern sensitivities and perspective on things. I guess again the key to remember is that God loves justice. Righteousness and justice are the foundation of your throne, said the psalmist. Now this is difficult to read the way that it works itself out, but God is still the same God of justice now as then. So the question then becomes, which we'll explore more in the discussion, what does that mean for us as Christians today? I mean, how do we wrestle with the fact that God is a God of justice? We clearly aren't going to go to the scale, to the direction of Jehu and launch out kind of trying to kill off anybody that is practicing injustice. But at the same time, to what extent should we be passive as Christians? How will the world know that God is a God, what the psalmist said, righteousness and justice are the foundation of your throne? How will the world know that justice is part of the foundation of God's throne if the church isn't displaying that in some way? So to what extent should we as the church wrestle with issues of justice? In a sense, because that reflects the character of God. I'll leave that for the conversation in a minute. But I do want to say a couple of things just to conclude before we break up into groups. simply because this is the last in our series on 2 Kings. Next week we have Jubilee, and then we'll start a new series not long after that. So as we finish running through these kind of studies in 1 and 2 Kings, and pause here for a while, and you reach the end of this section, and you have Jehu, the instrument of God's justice, who has swept through and killed off this royal house and killed the prophets of Baal. But we know with hindsight, from our perspective, this isn't actually going to solve the problem, and that several generations later, Jehu's house will be ended in bloodshed too. Where does all this leave us? What can we say as we kind of finish off these series of studies? I want to suggest two things that we can think on. I guess firstly, it simply reminds us that the old covenant is still weak. It's still powerless to bring real change. That Jehu was a change for the better for Israel, and things did improve. This was a chance for Israel to reset in a way. But for all the bloodshed at Jezreel, nothing really changed. So if nothing else, this passage reminds us that we need something even more powerful than Jehu. We need a new covenant, ultimately. We need Jesus. So the sense in which that this repeated cycle of failure to really renew and change things is a pointer to the fact that there's something better has to come. Because there's no other way it's going to work itself out. There's no other solution to it. We need Jesus. We need something new. We need the New Testament. The second thing I think it reminds us in these passages is that God loves justice. Now, as we said, there are problems with Jehu. He was a flawed instrument, and his actions had mixed motives. And there's a sense in which part of the problem wasn't so much he went too far. Part of the problem was he didn't go far enough. He didn't go far enough. He got rid of the prophets of Baal, but didn't get rid of the worship of the calves. Now, after this series in 2 Kings, we're going to start a series in Revelation. Now, that again will be a series broken up into bits, and we won't get as far as the last chapters as yet. But if you run that series through to the end of Revelation, you find Revelation 19, and you find the final agent of God's judgment. Jehu has been used by God as an agent of judgment, but it has been flawed and imperfect and hasn't done what you would hope it would do. But finally, when you hit Revelation 19, you find the final agent of judgment of God, which is Jesus himself. And he is the one who can truly mete out justice with completely and perfectly pure motives. And he is the one after whose actions things are finally resolved. Things are finally sorted. Justice is done. There's a sense in which the weaknesses of Jehu here remind us again of the need for someone who can do and who can be all that is really needed by humanity as a whole. And that again is Jesus. So for all the challenges and difficulties of this passage, in a sense of this series, which as our title has been, Riches to Rags, a kind of downward slope, it should at least remind us of the fact that we need someone greater and make us thankful for the fact that we live when we do, knowing that there is someone greater who came, Jesus, who died on the cross to give us new life, and Jesus who will come again and be God's agent of justice, but in a perfect and complete and pure way, and be what Jehu never could be, what any human could be, which we'll get to that eventually as we run through Revelation. Okay, so there's a couple of questions to think about, or sort of two-ish questions. So firstly, that idea that there can still be people like Jehu today, are there people that you think, you've seen, that Christians look to who might be like Jehu? Someone who comes into leadership and maybe a political or some kind of context, who is doing things that look good for the church, but whom we can be tempted to put our hope in rather than in God himself. And if there are people like that you can see in the world around us, how can we somehow make sure that our focus is on Jesus himself and not on the people that we believe Jesus is using? And then the second thing you can think about, start with whichever one you like and go how you want to. The second thing to think about is then just, if God is a God of justice, how does that work itself out today in the church? Are we supposed to let these issues slide because our focus is the gospel? Or are we supposed to somehow place some emphasis on it because our God is a God of justice? We want to show what God is like. How do we get that balance between these things? What should our response be as a church to injustice that we see in the world today, which is not something anyone's going to solve in 15 minutes, but it might provoke conversations.